This is the Middle-earth philosopher. One of the questions I've always had regarding the Silmarillion was if Galadriel and her father Finarfin had reunited momentarily after the War of Wrath, but before the large-scale migration from the now sinking Beleriand at the end of the First Age. Finarfin is most well known for being the one Noldor High Elf Lord who did not follow Feanor into Middle-earth. He forsook the march and his half-brother, finally, after the Alkalane battle and returned back to Valinor to seek the Valar's forgiveness, which was given, and they also decided to make him the High King of the Noldor in Beleriand, effectively giving the Noldor two High Kings. However, his brother, nieces, nephews, and children still followed after his mad half-brother, and of them all, the only one who survived, at least that we know of for certain, is Galadriel, because Maglor is kind of a question mark. Anyway, I feel like for sure he knew what was happening, at least somewhat, when his son, Finrod, was reincarnated back in Valinor after he had died. Which, by the way, also makes me wonder, as a side note, if Finrod too had returned during the War of Wrath, because it would make sense. Finrod may be the most likable and ambassador-like of the noble family, but the dude is still a Noldor. I don't care what color his hair is. Anyway, the last living son of Finwë is mentioned in the published Silmarillion as having led the Valinor Noldor faction to war, along with the rest of the Vanyar, who were under another leader. So it would make sense to me that after the fighting was concluded, that he would somehow seek for Galadriel, whom he surely would have known was still alive. Moreover, I can see him probably talking to Elendil back in Valinor about how the remaining elves were now either located in the Isle of Balar or in the southern forests of Beleriand, and that as far as he knew, they had not yet been touched by war, which, by the way, Maedhros tells the Green Elves that they're welcome. Anyways, so logically, Finarfin knew where to look. That said, how would this meeting have gone down? I mean, so much has happened since they last saw each other, centuries ago at this point. For certain, the elf woman that he would have met was not going to be the same person he raised in Valinor. Galadriel may have not seen actual combat, but for certain she saw its effects, in the loss of her brothers and cousins, sons of Feanor not included, unfortunately. The fleeing of Doria before or after their short war with the dwarves, after the death of her patron host Thingol, and his departure of his wife and her mentor, Melian, and seeing the destruction to Beleriand during the final years before the War of Wrath started. Then there's the wisdom she gained from Melian, which also seemed to mellow her out a bit. Because, yeah, younger Galadriel had a temper, and again, she was still a Noldor, no matter the hair color. And I can see Galadriel wanting to meet the victorious army and afterwards, for certain, wanting to see her father again. If I had to guess, it probably would have gone down similarly to how Melian's reunion with her daughter, Luthien, went after her resurrection. During that particular meeting, Melian was bereaved for the very first time in her immortality because she saw in Luthien's eyes that she was no longer immortal. And while Finarfin and Galadriel are still immortal, Galadriel is fundamentally a completely different woman now. The daughter that he raised back in Valinor is, for all intents and purposes, gone because of what she's seen, what she's lost, and what's gone down, what she's had to experience. So I think that Finarfin would have been overjoyed, obviously, but also filled with sorrow because he too would read the story in his daughter's eyes. I for certain would think they would talk about Finrod's resurrection, if we're going to go with the through line that he wasn't there during the War of Wrath. And if he was there, which I actually kind of like that line better, then it would have been even a better reunion. And he would have also met his son-in-law for the first time, Celeborn. I don't see Finarfin carrying the same prejudices towards the Dark Elves that many of his peers had. At some point, though, the Oliphant in the room was going to come out. the call for all elves in Beleriand to return with the army back to Valinor like they were supposed to, air quotes, back in the primordial past of the First Age. Behind the scenes, there's a debate on whether Galadriel, being one of the leaders of the Noldor rebellion, was even allowed to return back at this time. But whether she was or what wasn't, I honestly don't think it would have mattered, because say what you want about the Noldor being stubborn and unwise, they were committed motherfuckers. They're like dogs that can't let go of a bone once they get the idea in their heads. Galadriel isn't the hot-tempered rebel she once was, yes, and is much wiser than most, arguably, even at this point in time. But she still has that itch to rule her own place that she had back in Valinor. I also see that her love for her husband would play a major part in this decision as well. That having not seen the trees, let alone Valinor, the appeal to go west may not have had as much sway over him as it did his in-laws. And on top of all that, Celeborn was still Sindar. Elves seem to have a hierarchy of loyalties. Whether being a high elf or a dark elf, loyalty to your clan was still a top priority. Blood trumped almost everything else. And I think Galadriel might have been one of those exceptions where it didn't. She wouldn't be as mad or boastful about it per se, but she would ultimately reject her father's plea to come back and leave all the suffering behind. Because at this point, I'm pretty sure that any elf who was still in Valinor or who returned to Valinor after the call from the war saw Middle-earth now as a total shit show. And no doubt, Finarfin would have been perplexed at the very least by this choice, given all that's happened and how much smarter his daughter had become. In a farther way, I see an elvish version of "I told you so" being said here. If Finrod had also returned back to Middle-earth during the War of Wrath and had been at this hypothetical reunion, as it were, him, being ever the negotiator, would have talked down their father, seeing that not only would Galadriel not be swayed from her course, but also that perhaps this was not the right time for her to do so. Or, if Finrod hadn't been there, that Finarfin at the very least would have accepted her daughter's choice with a heavy heart. Either way, it would have been drama heavy, as most things with all Noldor are. It would have been good for such a reunion to take place and have that written down in the stories, given all that's happened, but the canon result would still be the same regardless. Finarfin, and maybe if Finrod showed up, Finrod, would still return back to Valinor, and Galadriel would continue on with her husband and the rest of the story of Middle-earth as canon goes. But let me know your thoughts below on this possibility, and if you have any extra information that I may have missed or that you happen to know about that I don't, please feel free to comment below about that. Otherwise, this is the Miller Philosopher. Have a good day.